All right, ready to dive into a fascinating case of corporate insolvency in India.
Absolutely.
We're taking a look at Autopal Industries Limited,
Yeah.
a company with a pretty long history in the automotive parts industry.
Yeah, they've got quite a history.
Trying to figure out how they ended up in such a tough spot.
Right. And you know what's so interesting about this particular case?
What's that?
This wasn't some new company, just starting out and maybe things didn't work out.
Right.
Autopal was incorporated back in 1985.
Right.
So they had a solid 3 decades under their belt
Wow.
before running into these problems.
In the automotive parts industry, you said?
That's right, automotive parts.
Okay.
And the documents we have paint a really fascinating picture of this whole saga.
Yeah, speaking of documents, what are we working with here?
So we've got court orders and legal documents from the National Company Law Tribunal,
Okay.
specifically the Jaipur bench,
Gotcha.
that detail everything that went down.
So we're talking about a company, Autopal, that seemingly was doing pretty well for a long time.
It seems that way, yeah.
What happened?
Yeah, what set them on this downward spiral?
Right.
It's tough to say for sure. The documents themselves don't really dive deep into the root causes of their financial distress.
Okay.
But what they do offer is a really detailed play-by-play of the legal battle that unfolded.
Okay.
And it all started with Intech Capital,
Intech Capital.
a financial creditor
Okay.
who decided to file an insolvency petition against Autopal.
So that's the first domino to fall.
Yeah, you could say that.
Intech Capital goes after them?
Right. They filed under Section 7 of the IBC,
IBC.
the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016,
Right.
which is basically the rule book for dealing with these situations in India.
Gotcha.
But, and here's where things get a little strange.
Okay.
Intech Capital, they ended up withdrawing their case.
Really?
Yeah.
So they just backed down.
They did.
That's pretty unusual, isn't it?
It is unusual, yeah. You don't see that every day.
What happened there?
Well, the court orders don't really give us a clear reason why Intech Capital decided to pull out. Like, there's no smoking gun or anything like that.
Right.
The NCLT, the tribunal, they just granted permission, and that was the case was dismissed.
It makes you wonder if there were maybe some backroom conversations or something that happened.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It definitely makes you curious. What went on behind the scenes?
For sure.
What were they talking about that we're not privy to?
Exactly.
But yeah, it's definitely a bit of a head scratcher.
It's like a corporate mystery novel or something.
Right.
But if in Tank, a major creditor like that backs down, you would almost assume that things couldn't be that bad for Autopal.
Right. You would think so, right?
Right.
If a big player like that backs off, maybe things aren't so dire.
Yeah.
But that's not quite how this story unfolds.
Okay.
And that's where M/S Tac Innovations enters the picture.
Okay, Tac Innovations.
They're a supplier of adhesive tapes and sealants.
Adhesive tapes and sealants.
Yeah, kind of a specific niche.
Okay.
But they become a really pivotal player
Interesting.
in Autopal's fate.
Okay, so Tac Innovations comes in. Now, were they a big creditor too?
Not at all, actually. Their claim was surprisingly small.
Okay.
Just over Rs 3.5 lakhs, including interest, unpaid supplies.
Okay, so really a drop in the bucket compared to Autopal's, I'm assuming, bigger financial picture?
Exactly, a tiny blip on the radar.
Wow, that is a David and Goliath situation.
You could say that, yeah.
What did Tac Innovations do? Did they try to negotiate with Autopal at all?
They did. They tried to work it out.
Okay.
Sent multiple notices.
Okay.
Detailing the entire transaction.
Bounced
checks, all of it. It's all there in the court documents.
Okay.
Autopal, on the other hand,
Yeah.
they came up with a bunch of defenses.
Such as?
They claimed that the goods weren't up to par, said they overpaid, even claimed they couldn't access their new server
Really?
to verify the debt.
A new server? What a coincidence.
Right. It's a little convenient.
So Autopal was putting up a fight.
Oh, yeah.
But with such a small amount, why do you think this went as far as it did?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
It really is.
Yeah.
Why this tiny debt became such a big deal.
Right.
It makes you think that maybe this was just a symptom of a much larger problem brewing within Autopal.
Okay.
But ultimately,
Yeah.
the NCLT, they're the ones who had to make sense of all this.
Right. Acting as the judge.
Exactly.
In this case.
They reviewed every single argument,
Okay.
every piece of evidence that was presented.
And what was their verdict?
Well, they didn't side with Autopal.
Okay.
They ultimately found that Autopal's defenses, while creative,
weren't convincing enough. They sided with tack innovations.
Interesting.
And that my friend
Yeah.
set off a chain of events that would
Okay.
completely changed
Alright.
Autopal's trajectory.
So this seemingly insignificant debt ended up becoming Autopal's downfall.
In a way, yes, it did.
Wow.
Yeah. But by admitting tack innovation's application,
Right.
the NCLT basically opened the door for Autopal
Yeah.
to enter the corporate insolvency resolution process.
Okay.
Or CRP for short.
The CRP, go.
Now, this process, it's designed to help revive struggling companies.
Right.
But it's not a walk in the park.
Sure.
It's a pretty complex process with a lot of moving parts.
So Autopal is officially in CRP. Now,
Yeah.
what happens next?
Right.
Do they just shut down the company,
Yeah.
sell off all the assets? Not necessarily.
Okay.
The whole point of CRP is to explore every possible avenue for revival
Okay.
before resorting to liquidation.
Right.
It's really about finding the best possible outcome
Yeah.
for everyone involved,
Okay.
especially the creditors,
Makes sense.
the ones who are owed money.
Right, of course.
So it's not just a fire sale. It's
Right.
a much more nuanced approach.
So it's like hitting the reset button on the company,
Right.
but under very strict supervision.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And to oversee this whole process,
Right.
the NCLT, they appointed Mr. Ajay Gupta as the interim resolution professional,
All right.
or IRP.
IRP. Got it.
Think of the IRP as a sort of caretaker CEO,
Okay.
someone who's brought in to steer the company through this really critical phase.
Interesting. So what does this IRP actually do?
Yeah, what are their main responsibilities?
Right.
Well, they wear many hats.
Okay.
In Autopal's case, Mr. Gupta would have had to take stock of the company's financial situation,
Right?
gather claims from all the creditors,
Mhm.
and try to develop a plan
Okay.
to either revive the business
Right.
or find a suitable buyer,
Yeah.
all while navigating the complexities of the legal process.
Right.
And of course,
Yeah.
keeping the NCLT informed every step of the way.
Sounds like a challenging job.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially with so many stakeholders involved.
Right. And so much at stake.
Exactly. And remember those other creditors we mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
Specifically, Reliance Commercial Finance Limited, or RCFL.
RCFLs. Right.
They had a much larger claim on Autopal's assets
Okay.
than Tech Innovations did.
Right. So RCFL, holding a bigger piece of the pie, kind of enters the scene now.
Exactly.
How does that change things?
Well, with the initiation of CRP,
Yeah.
a committee of creditors is formed,
Committee of Creditors.
or COSI for short.
COSI, got it.
And it's basically a group
Okay.
that comprises all of Autopal's creditors,
Okay.
and their voting power
Right.
is determined by the size of their claims.
So bigger claim equals more say in how things are handled.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay.
So in this case,
Yeah.
our CFL came in with a whopping 64.20% voting share
Wow. Okay.
in the code.
So they're a dominant force.
Absolutely. They had a major say
Right.
in the decision-making process.
Gotcha.
Then you had Paisalo Digital
Okay.
with 20.74%. And then the legal heirs of a Mr. Bhagwant Singh Solanki,
Okay.
holding the remaining 15.06%.
So you've got this committee now,
Right.
and they're trying to figure out how to deal with Autopal's situation.
Exactly.
Was it smooth sailing from there?
Well, not quite.
No.
Remember those CRP costs we mentioned?
Yeah, the expenses involved
Oh,
in
yeah.
this whole process.
Well, they started to add up.
Okay.
And who was going to foot the bill?
Yeah. Who's paying for all this?
That became a point of contention.
I bet.
It turned out that Mr. Solanki,
Yeah.
despite having a smaller stake,
Right.
had already paid a significant portion of his share of the expenses.
But the bigger players, RCFL and Paisalo, hadn't?
That's right.
That seems like a recipe for conflict.
It definitely added another layer of complexity to this situation. And to make matters even more complicated,
Oh,
Paisal Digital initially withdrew its claim,
really?
only to rejoin the COSI later.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that raised some legal questions
I bet it did.
about their voting rights
Right.
and their financial obligations regarding the CRP costs.
Wow. So we've got conflicting interests, we've got legal maneuvering,
It's a lot.
and mounting expenses. You mentioned recurring rental fees for Autopal's assets, too.
Yeah, those were definitely a factor.
How did all this impact the search for a resolution?
It definitely presented some challenges.
I bet.
Imagine trying to revive a company
Right.
or find a buyer
Yeah.
while you're simultaneously navigating disagreements
Right.
over finances and legal technicality.
Within the COSI itself.
Exactly. It's a very delicate balancing act.
It sounds incredibly intricate.
It is
So-
that thing.
There's a lot going on.
Did the IRP, Mr. Gupta, manage to find a solution amidst all this?
He did.
Okay.
Despite the hurdles,
Yeah.
a resolution plan did emerge.
Okay, so there's hope for Autopal after all.
There is.
Okay, what did their plan entail?
So it was put forward by two individuals,
Okay.
Mr. Vivek Kumar Radhakonda
Okay.
and Mr. Rajastranavas Nandagam.
All right.
And they saw some potential in Autopal's future.
Okay.
Their plan centered on a rather interesting strategy.
What's that?
A merger.
A merger. Okay.
They proposed a scheme of arrangement,
Scheme of arrangement.
which essentially involved Autopal being absorbed by another company
Okay.
called RNIT Solution Services Limited.
Interesting. So a complete absorption, not just a partial acquisition.
Right, it's a full takeover.
Yeah.
So tell me more about this scheme of arrangement. How would it impact Autopal and its creditors?
So basically, Autopal, as it stood, would cease to exist.
So-
All of its assets, liabilities, everything
Right.
would be transferred over to RNIT Solution Services Limited,
Gotcha.
which would then become the new owner.
Okay.
This transfer would be done under the watchful eye of the NCLT, of course, to ensure everything is above board.
Right. So Autopal essentially gets a fresh start, a clean slate under new ownership.
Exactly. That's the idea.
What about the creditors, though? How does this scheme of arrangement affect what they're owed?
That's the key part of this whole process.
Yeah.
The scheme of arrangement would lay out exactly how the creditors would be compensated.
Okay.
It would detail how much of their original claims they would recover and the timeline for those payments.
Gotcha.
Everything has to be clearly defined
Right.
and approved
Yeah.
by both the COSI
Right.
and the NCLT.
So it's not just a simple handover.
No, it's much more involved than that.
It's a carefully structured plan to address all the financial intricacies of Autopal's situation.
Exactly. It's all about finding a way to make everyone whole again.
And ultimately, the NCLT gets the final say, right?
Absolutely. They have the final word.
So the fate of Autopal, their future, is now in the hands of the NCLT. Did they give it the green light?
They did, but not before really scrutinizing everything.
Of course.
You know, the NCLT's role is to make sure
Right.
this resolution plan follows the IBC guidelines.
Right. It's got to be by the book.
Exactly. And it also has to be in the best interest of everybody involved.
Of all the stakeholders.
All the stakeholders, yeah.
So they weren't just going to rubber stamp this merger. What were they looking at specifically?
Well, first, they wanted to be absolutely sure that Mr. Radhakonda, the resolution applicant, was the right guy for the job.
Yeah. Did he have the chops for this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they dug into his background, looked at his financial history, you name it.
Really did their due diligence.
Oh, yeah, no stone unturned.
Making sure he had the know-how, the actual capacity to take all this on.
Exactly. And they wanted to see a clear plan for Autopal's revival, how this merger with RNIT Solution Services Limited would actually work.
Right, a roadmap for the future.
Exactly. And after looking at everything, the NCLT gave their approval.
Autopal gets a fresh start.
They do.
How did this corporate makeover actually happen?
It was a whole process. Yeah.
First, they had to officially transfer all of Autopal's assets and liabilities over to RNIT.
The new owners.
The new owners, right? And once that was done, the original Autopal entity, the one incorporated back in 1985, was dissolved.
Wow. The old Autopal was no more.
Gone.
Did they relocate the headquarters too?
They did. They moved everything from Rajasthan to Telangana.
A fresh start, a new location.
Exactly, a whole new chapter.
It really shows how much a company can change during this process.
It's pretty remarkable.
Looking back at Autopal's journey, what are some key things that stand out to you?
You know, it's fascinating how this small debt from TAC Innovations could have such a huge impact. It really shows that financial trouble can pop up in unexpected ways.
It's a good reminder that even companies with a long history aren't immune to these challenges. Exactly. No one is invincible. And then there's the whole CRRP process, which is so complex.
Yeah, lots of moving parts.
You've got all these different stakeholders, all with their own agendas, and this framework that requires such meticulous scrutiny.
And it's not always smooth sailing, as we saw with Autopal.
Definitely not.
Disagreements,
Yeah.
legal maneuvers, the pressure to find a solution that works for everyone.
It's a lot to juggle. Which brings us to what might be the most interesting part of this whole case. Do you remember how the resolution plan talked about a monitoring committee?
Yeah, they were supposed to keep an eye on the merger, make sure everything went according to plan.
Right. But here's the thing. The court documents, while they say this committee is necessary, they don't actually say who should be on it.
So who gets to influence the new Autopal is kind of up in the air.
That's wild. It is interesting. Makes you wonder who's pushing for that vagueness and why. Is it to be flexible or is it something more strategic, to control things from behind the scenes?
It definitely adds another layer to this whole thing. And it makes you think, who should have a say in Autopal's future? Is it just the new owners? Or should others, maybe even former employees, have a voice?
That's the question, isn't it? Because for this resolution to really work, for Autopal to succeed, it'll come down to the decisions made, the people at the table, and a real commitment to transparency long after this case is closed.
It's a great point to end on. This deep dive into Autopal's insolvency is a reminder that corporate struggles are often more complex than they appear, and the journey to resolution is rarely straightforward. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Catch you in the next episode.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.